The snow fell like judgment from a merciless sky, each flake a cold accusation against Emma Price as she collapsed to her knees in the drifting white. Her black morning dress, already threadbare from weeks of travel, offered no protection against the mountain wind that cut through the fabric like a blade through paper. The leather satchel containing her last possessions slipped from her numb fingers, spilling its meager contents across the pristine snow. A few coins glinted briefly before disappearing beneath the relentless downfall. Her breath came in ragged gasps that crystallized in the frigid air. The funeral parlor in Denver had taken everything else, every last cent she had scraped together, leaving her with nothing but empty promises and a husband's body that would never make it home to Pennsylvania. Now, 3 days into her desperate journey back east, the stagecoach had broken down 20 miles from the nearest settlement, and the driver had simply unhitched his horses and ridden away, abandoning her and two other passengers to whatever fate the wilderness might decree. The other passengers, a merchant and his wife, had struck out on foot hours ago, their city shoes crunching through the snow as they disappeared around a bend in the mountain trail. They had not asked her to come with them. A widow without means was a burden they could not afford, and Emma understood their calculation, even as it left her heart hollow with despair. Now the silence pressed against her eardrums like a physical weight, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pine boughs and her own labored breathing. The cold seeped through her worn boots, numbing her feet until she could no longer feel the rocky ground beneath the snow. Her fingers, already blue at the tips, refused to close properly around the scattered coins as she tried desperately to gather them back into the satchel. This was how it would end, then. Not in the warm bed she had shared with Thomas for 12 years, not surrounded by the familiar walls of their little house with its yellow kitchen curtains and the garden she had tended with such care. Instead, she would become another casualty of the unforgiving mountains. Another story whispered in saloons about the dangers that waited beyond the safety of civilization. The thought of Thomas brought fresh tears that froze on her cheeks before they could fall. He had come west chasing gold and glory, convinced that their fortune lay buried in the Colorado hills. Instead, he had found only a mine collapse and a death far from home. She had sold everything to bring his body back east for burial, but even that final act of love had been denied her by men who cared more for profit than for a widow's grief. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The sound of approaching footsteps crunched through the snow, steady and deliberate. Emma looked up through her tears to see a figure emerging from the tree line, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the easy confidence of a man who belonged in this harsh landscape. He wore a heavy coat of dark wool and leather boots that came nearly to his knees. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but she could see the careful way he studied her situation, taking in the scattered belongings, the broken satchel, the obvious desperation of her circumstances. Michael Jones had been tracking the broken stagecoach for the better part of the afternoon. He had seen the wheel marks veering off the main trail, had found the abandoned coach with its splintered axle and the clear signs of passengers striking out on foot. The merchant and his wife had passed his cabin hours earlier, their faces grim with determination and fear. They had mentioned the widow left behind, but Michael had assumed she would follow eventually or find her own way to safety. Now, seeing her collapsed in the snow with darkness approaching and the temperature dropping fast, he realized how wrong that assumption had been. Emma Price was not built for mountain survival. Her slight frame and city clothes marked her as clearly as if she wore a sign announcing her vulnerability to every predator, human or otherwise, that roamed these hills. He approached slowly, his hands visible and empty, the way he might approach a wounded animal that could bolt at any sudden movement. Her eyes, wide with fear and exhaustion, tracked his every step. There was intelligence there, and a stubborn pride that had not yet been completely broken by her circumstances. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "you cannot stay here." Emma tried to rise, her legs shaking with cold and fatigue. "I have money," she said, though her voice cracked on the words. "I can pay for passage to the next town." Michael glanced at the few coins scattered in the snow, their small denomination obvious even from a distance. Whatever funds she might have possessed were clearly exhausted, and the nearest town was still a hard day's walk through terrain that would challenge an experienced mountaineer. "The next settlement is 20 miles east," he said, "through country that will kill you before dawn if this storm worsens." As if summoned by his words, the wind picked up, driving the snow horizontal and reducing visibility to mere yards. Emma pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, a gesture so futile that it might have been comical under different circumstances. "Then I will die here," she said, and there was a terrible resignation in her voice that spoke of losses too great to bear. "I have nowhere else to go." Michael studied her for a long moment, weighing options and obligations. He was not a man given to sentiment or unnecessary charity. The mountains had taught him that survival often demanded hard choices, that resources spent on the weak could mean death for the strong. But there was something in Emma Price's bearing, even in her defeat, that spoke of a strength not yet fully broken. "Not today, woman," he said finally. "Not on my mountain." Without waiting for her response, he began gathering her scattered belongings, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he collected the few coins and placed them back in her damaged satchel. Emma watched him work, confusion and hope warring in her expression. "I cannot pay you what such help is worth," she said. "Did not ask for payment." He straightened, her satchel in one hand. "My cabin is half a mile through those trees. You can shelter there until the storm passes and decide what comes next." Emma hesitated, and Michael could read the calculation in her eyes. She was weighing the risks of accepting help from a stranger against the certainty of death if she remained where she was. It was the same arithmetic that governed all life in the wilderness, the constant evaluation of danger against necessity. "How do I know you mean no harm?" she asked. Michael considered the question seriously. "You do not," he said. "But staying here guarantees what following me only makes possible." The logic was unassailable, and Emma knew it. She nodded slowly and allowed him to help her to her feet. Her legs nearly buckled under her own weight, and Michael steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I can walk," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. The journey to Michael's cabin took nearly an hour through snow that reached past Emma's knees in places. Michael broke trail ahead of her, his long strides creating a path she could follow, but even so, the effort left her gasping and stumbling. Twice she fell, and twice Michael helped her back to her feet without comment or impatience. The cabin, when it finally appeared through the swirling snow, was larger and more substantial than Emma had expected. Built of thick logs chinked with clay and moss, it squatted against the mountainside like something that had grown from the earth itself. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and warm yellow light glowed behind oiled paper windows. Michael led her up the steps to a covered porch where split wood was stacked in neat rows. He opened the heavy door and gestured for her to enter first, a courtesy that surprised her given the circumstances of their meeting. The interior was spartanly furnished but clean and well-maintained. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth crackling with a fire that filled the single room with blessed warmth. A simple table and two chairs occupied the center of the space, while a narrow bed was pushed against the far wall. Shelves lined the walls, holding books, tools, and supplies in careful organization. Emma stood just inside the doorway, suddenly uncertain. The warmth of the fire made her realize how deeply the cold had penetrated her bones, and she began to shiver uncontrollably as her body tried to restore circulation to her extremities. Michael hung his hat and coat on pegs beside the door, then moved to the fireplace to add another log. "Sit by the fire," he said without turning around. "Get warm." Emma approached the hearth cautiously, her wet boots squelching against the plank floor. She settled into one of the chairs and held her hands toward the flames, gasping as sensation began to return to her fingers. The pain of warming was almost worse than the numbness had been. Michael moved about the cabin with quiet efficiency, setting a kettle to boil on a hook over the fire and retrieving supplies from his shelves. Emma watched him work, trying to reconcile his gentle ministrations with the hard edges of his appearance. His hands, she noticed, were scarred and calloused from years of manual labor, but they handled the delicate china teacup with surprising care. "You live here alone?" she asked. "I do." He measured tea leaves into a small pot with the precision of long practice. "It must be lonely." Michael glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Loneliness is a choice," he said. "Same as company." Emma considered this, turning the words over in her mind as she watched the flames dance in the fireplace. She had never thought of loneliness as something one could choose, but perhaps that was because she had never truly been alone until Thomas died. Even now, Surrounded by the warmth and safety of Michael's cabin, she felt the hollow ache of loss that had become her constant companion. The kettle began to whistle, and Michael poured the steaming water over the tea leaves. The familiar ritual was comforting in its normalcy, a reminder that even in this remote place, some civilized customs persisted. "Tell me about your husband," Michael said as he handed her the cup. Emma accepted the tea gratefully, wrapping her still cold fingers around the warm ceramic. "Thomas was a dreamer," she said. "He believed in golden mountains and easy fortune. I should have tried harder to dissuade him from coming west." "Would he have listened?" Emma smiled sadly. "No. Thomas never listened to practical advice. He said it lacked imagination." "Imagination has its place," Michael said, "but it will not fill an empty belly or turn aside a winter storm." "No," Emma agreed. "It will not." They sat in comfortable silence for a time, sipping their tea and listening to the wind howl around the cabin walls. The storm showed no signs of abating, and Emma found herself grateful for the solid construction that kept the elements at bay. "What will you do now?" Michael asked, eventually. Emma set down her empty cup and stared into the fire. "I do not know," she admitted. "I sold everything to bring Thomas home, but there was not enough. The funeral parlor kept his body for their fees, and I have nothing left to return to in Pennsylvania." "No family?" "Thomas was my family." The words came out more bitter than she had intended. "His relatives never approved of our marriage. They will not welcome his penniless widow." Michael nodded as if he understood the arithmetic of abandonment. "The mountains are hard," he said, "but they are honest. They will kill you if you are weak or foolish, but they do not lie about their intentions." "Unlike people," Emma said. "Unlike people," he agreed. The conversation lapsed again, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. Emma found herself studying Michael's profile as he stared into the fire, noting the way the light played across the strong lines of his face. There was something peaceful about his presence, a stillness that spoke of a man comfortable with solitude and silence. "How long have you lived here?" she asked. 5 years, near enough." Michael rose to add another log to the fire, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. "Built this place myself after I left the army." "You were a soldier?" "For a time." His tone suggested that this was not a topic he wished to explore, and Emma did not press. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the cabin, but the thick walls and tight construction held firm against the wind. Emma felt her eyelids growing heavy as the warmth and exhaustion of the day caught up with her. "You should rest," Michael said, as if reading her thoughts. "Take the bed." "I will sleep by the fire." Emma started to protest, but Michael held up a hand to forestall her objections. "The bed is warmer and more comfortable," he said. "You need the rest more than I do." Too tired to argue further, Emma accepted his offer with gratitude. She settled onto the narrow bed, pulling the heavy wool blankets up to her chin. The mattress was filled with what felt like pine needles and moss, but after days of sleeping on hard ground, it felt luxurious. As she drifted toward sleep, she could hear Michael moving quietly about the cabin, banking the fire and securing the door against the storm. The sounds were domestic and comforting, reminding her of the nights when Thomas would check the locks and tend the fire before coming to bed. But this was different somehow. Where Thomas had been careless and optimistic, Michael moved with the careful deliberation of a man who understood that survival depended on attention to detail. There was something reassuring about his competence, a steadiness that Emma had not realized she craved until she found it. She woke before dawn to the smell of bacon frying and coffee brewing. Michael was already up, moving quietly around the small kitchen area so as not to disturb her rest. Emma lay still for a moment, watching him work and marveling at how normal this felt, how right it seemed to wake to the sounds of someone else beginning the day. "Good morning," she said softly. Michael turned, a slight smile creasing his weathered features. "Morning. Storm passed in the night. Should be clear traveling today." Emma felt a pang of disappointment at his words, though she could not have said exactly why. "Then I should be going. Where?" The question was asked without judgment, but it highlighted the fundamental problem that had not changed overnight. Emma sat up, pushing her hair back from her face. In the morning light, her situation seemed no less dire than it had the evening before. She had no money for passage east, no family to return to, and no skills that would allow her to support herself in the wilderness. "I do not know," she admitted. Michael served breakfast in silence, setting a plate of bacon and eggs before her along with a cup of strong coffee. Emma ate gratefully, realizing that she had not had a proper meal in days. "There is a town called Cedar Falls about 40 miles south," Michael said as they ate. "Not much of a place, but they have a school. Teacher left last month to get married. They might have need of someone with education." Emma looked up from her plate, hope flickering in her chest. "You think I could teach? Can you read and write? Do sums?" "Yes, of course." "Then you can teach mountain children to do the same. Pay would not be much, but it would be honest work." Emma considered this possibility, turning it over in her mind like a precious stone examined for flaws. Teaching had never occurred to her as an option, but she had helped Thomas with his correspondence and had always been quick with figures. "How would I get there?" she asked. "I could take you." The offer was made casually, as if it were a small thing rather than a journey that would require days of his time. "Why would you do that?" Michael was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the snow-covered landscape beyond. "Maybe because someone should," he said finally. After breakfast, Michael began preparations for the journey to Cedar Falls. He moved through his cabin with systematic efficiency, gathering supplies and checking equipment with the thoroughness of a man who understood that overlooked details could mean the difference between life and death in the wilderness. Emma watched him work, feeling useless and in the way. "Is there something I can do to help?" Michael glanced at her, taking in her city clothes and obvious inexperience with mountain travel. "Can you ride?" "Some. Thomas and I had a small mare back in Pennsylvania." "Good enough." Michael pulled a heavy coat from a chest and held it out to her. "This belonged to my sister. Should fit well enough." Emma accepted the coat, noting its quality construction and warm wool lining. "Where is your sister now?" "Died of fever 3 winters back." Michael's voice was matter-of-fact, but Emma caught the brief shadow that crossed his features. "She came west with her husband to Homestead. Mountain winters are hard on people not born to them." Emma slipped into the coat, finding it slightly large but wonderfully warm. "I am sorry for your loss." "Do in." Michael nodded acknowledgement but did not elaborate. Emma was beginning to understand that he was a man who kept his grief private, who dealt with loss the way he dealt with everything else, through practical action rather than emotional expression. They set out as the sun climbed above the eastern peaks, Michael leading a sturdy mountain horse, while Emma rode a smaller mare that seemed well suited to the rough terrain. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving the world transformed into a pristine wilderness of white, punctuated by the dark green of pine trees and the gray thrust of granite peaks. Emma had never seen country like this, so vast and untamed that it made her feel simultaneously insignificant and exhilarated. The air was thin and sharp in her lungs, carrying scents of pine and snow and something else she could not identify. Something wild and clean that seemed to wash away the staleness of her grief. They rode in comfortable silence for the most part, Michael setting a steady pace that ate up the miles without exhausting the horses. Occasionally, he would point out landmarks or explain some aspect of mountain travel, but he was not given to unnecessary conversation. As the day wore on, Emma found herself studying her companion with growing curiosity. There was something about Michael Jones that did not quite fit the image of a simple mountain hermit. His speech, while economical, was educated, and his mannerisms suggested a background more refined than his current circumstances might indicate. "You said you were in the army," she ventured during one of their brief rest stops. Michael was checking the horse's hooves for stones, a task that required his full attention. "I did. What made you leave?" He straightened, his expression carefully neutral. "War ended. Time to find something else to do." Emma sensed there was more to the story, but she did not press. Everyone, she was learning, carried secrets shaped by loss and disappointment. Michael's past was his own business, just as her future was hers to determine. They made camp that evening in a sheltered grove where Michael built a fire and prepared a simple meal of beans and salt pork. Emma sat close to the flames, grateful for the warmth and the company, though she found herself wondering what would happen when they reached Cedar Falls and their paths diverged. "Tell me about this town," she said as they ate. "Not much to tell. Maybe 200 people, mostly miners and their families. One store, one saloon, one church. School is just a log building with benches and a blackboard. And they need a teacher? Children need learning, same as anywhere else. Maybe more so out here, where ignorance can kill you. Emma nodded, understanding the truth of his words. The wilderness demanded knowledge and skill that went far beyond what she had needed in her comfortable Pennsylvania life. What if they do not want me? She asked. Michael looked at her across the fire, his expression serious. Then you will find something else. Mountains are full of opportunities for people willing to work. Such as cooking, cleaning, sewing, tending sick folk. Women with sense and determination can make their way same as men, if they are willing to adapt. Emma considered this as she stared into the dancing flames. Adaptation. It was not a concept that had figured prominently in her previous life, where routines and expectations had provided comfortable structure. But Thomas's death had shattered that structure, leaving her adrift in circumstances that demanded new skills and new ways of thinking. I have never lived anywhere but Pennsylvania, she said. Where you have been matters less than where you are going, Michael replied. They slept that night under a canopy of stars so brilliant that Emma lay awake for hours just staring up at them. In Pennsylvania, the night sky had been a familiar presence, but here in the thin mountain air, the stars seemed close enough to touch, a vast display of light that made her feel both humbled and somehow connected to something larger than her own small troubles. The second day of travel brought them down from the high peaks into a valley where the snow was less deep and the air warmer. Emma began to see signs of human habitation: cleared fields, fence lines, the distant smoke of chimneys. The sight filled her with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. How much farther? She asked. Few more hours. Michael studied the sky, where clouds were beginning to gather. Should make it before the next storm. For matter, they crested a ridge in mid-afternoon, and Cedar Falls spread out below them, a small collection of wooden buildings clustered around what appeared to be a main street. It was larger than Emma had expected, but still small enough that she could see from one end to the other. There. Michael pointed to a log building set slightly apart from the others. That is the school. Emma studied the structure, trying to imagine herself standing before a classroom of mountain children, teaching them to read and write and cipher. The prospect was both terrifying and oddly appealing. They rode down into the town as the first fat snowflakes of the approaching storm began to fall. People stopped to stare as they passed, their expressions curious but not unfriendly. Emma was acutely aware of her borrowed coat and travel-stained dress, of how she must appear to these practical mountain folk. Michael led them to a building with a sign that read General Store and helped Emma dismount. Her legs were stiff from 2 days in the saddle, and she had to hold on to the horse's stirrup for a moment to steady herself. Frank Green runs the store, Michael explained. He is also on the school board. If anyone can tell you about the teaching position, it would be him. Emma nodded, suddenly nervous. This was the moment of truth, when she would discover whether Michael's suggestion had merit or whether she would find herself once again without prospects. The store's interior was warm and cluttered, filled with the mingled scents of coffee, leather, and tobacco. A heavy-set man with graying hair looked up from behind the counter as they entered, his expression shifting from polite interest to recognition when he saw Michael. Michael Jones, he said with genuine pleasure. Been a while since you came down from your mountain. Frank. Michael nodded greeting. Like you to meet Emma Price. She is looking for work. Heard you might need a teacher. Frank Green studied Emma with shrewd eyes, taking in her appearance and bearing with the assessment of a man accustomed to evaluating people quickly and accurately. You have teaching experience, Mrs. Price? Some, Emma said, then decided honesty would serve her better than false confidence. I helped my husband with his correspondence and kept the books for his business. I can read, write, and do sums well enough. What happened to your husband? He died in a mine accident near Denver. I am trying to make a new start. Frank nodded, his expression softening slightly. Mountains are hard on dreamers, he said, but they reward practical folks willing to work. Can you handle children? I believe so. Some of these mountain children are rough around the edges. Parents too busy surviving to worry much about manners. You would need to be firm, but fair. Emma thought of the challenges she had already faced, of the strength she had discovered in herself over the past weeks. I can be firm when necessary. Frank Green studied her for another long moment. then seemed to reach a decision. Pay is $20 a month plus room and board. Not much, but it is honest work. School term runs until spring. Then we see how things go. $20 a month seemed like a fortune to Emma after her recent destitution. When would I start? Monday, if you are willing. There is a small room behind the school where the teacher lives. Nothing fancy, but it is warm and dry. Emma felt a surge of relief so intense it nearly brought tears to her eyes. Yes, she said. I would be very grateful for the opportunity. Good. Frank extended his hand, and Emma shook it firmly. Welcome to Cedar Falls, Mrs. Price. As they concluded the arrangements, Emma became aware that Michael had stepped back, allowing her to handle the negotiation herself. When she glanced at him, she saw approval in his expression, a recognition of her growing confidence. They left the store as the snow began to fall more heavily, and Frank Green directed them to the schoolhouse. It was a simple log structure with a stone chimney and 2 windows that let in what light the cloudy day provided. The interior was sparse but clean, with wooden benches arranged in rows facing a blackboard mounted on the front wall. The living quarters behind the main room were even simpler. A small bedroom with a narrow bed, a tiny kitchen area with a wood stove, and a sitting area with a single chair and small table. But to Emma, who had spent the past weeks wondering where she would sleep each night, it looked like luxury. It is perfect, she said, and meant it. Michael helped her carry in her few belongings, then stood awkwardly in the doorway as if uncertain whether to stay or go. I should head back before this storm gets worse, he said finally. Emma felt a sudden panic at the thought of his departure. Over the past 3 days, Michael had become her anchor, the steady presence that made her believe she could survive whatever challenges lay ahead. Will I see you again? She asked. Cedar Falls is not so far from my cabin, he said. I come down for supplies from time to time. It was not quite a promise, but it was something. Emma nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. Thank you, she said, for everything. I do not know how to repay such kindness. Michael looked uncomfortable with her gratitude. No debt, he said. You would have done the same. Would I? Emma was not certain that was true. Before Thomas's death, before her journey west and the harsh lessons of survival, she might have been too concerned with propriety and convention to help a stranger in need. You will, Michael said with quiet certainty. Mountains change people, make them stronger, if they let it. He touched the brim of his hat in farewell and disappeared into the swirling snow, leading his horses back toward the high country. Emma watched from the window until he vanished from sight, then turned to survey her new home. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation and nervous anticipation. Emma cleaned the schoolhouse thoroughly, organized the few books and supplies she found, and tried to prepare lessons for students she had never met. The people of Cedar Falls were polite but reserved, watching the new teacher with the careful assessment mountain folk reserve for outsiders. On Sunday, she attended services at the small church, where Reverend Richard Flores welcomed her warmly and introduced her to several families whose children would be her students. The parents seemed cautiously optimistic about having a teacher again, though Emma sensed they were withholding judgment until they saw how she handled their offspring. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, with fresh snow covering the ground. Emma stood before the blackboard in her best dress, hands trembling slightly as she heard the sound of approaching voices. The door opened, and children began filing in, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 15, their faces curious and slightly suspicious. Good morning, Emma said, her voice steadier than she felt. I am Mrs. Price, your new teacher. The children settled onto the wooden benches with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Emma could see immediately that Frank Green had not exaggerated about their rough edges. These were not the well-scrubbed, properly dressed pupils she might have expected in a Pennsylvania classroom. Their clothes were practical and often patched. Their hands showed the calluses of children expected to contribute to family survival, and their eyes held a wariness that spoke of hard-earned maturity. Let us begin by getting acquainted, Emma said. Please tell me your name and something about yourself. The introductions revealed a diverse group. There was Dorothy Campbell, a serious 12-year-old whose family ran a small ranch, Helen Ross, whose father worked one of the nearby mines, little Deborah Johnson, barely 6 and clearly terrified to be away from her mother, and Ronald Turner, a lanky 15-year-old who slouched in the back row with the air of someone who had better things to do. Emma quickly realized that the children's educational backgrounds varied wildly. Some could barely write their names, while others had clearly received instruction at home and were reading at levels well beyond their years. The challenge would be finding ways to engage all of them simultaneously. She began with basic assessments, moving among the students to gauge their individual capabilities. Dorothy Campbell impressed her with neat handwriting and solid arithmetic skills. Helen Ross struggled with reading but showed aptitude for numbers. Ronald Turner made it clear through his body language that he considered himself too old and too important for schooling, though Emma suspected his resistance masked insecurity about his abilities. By the end of the first week, Emma had established routines and begun to win over most of her students. She discovered that mountain children, while rough around the edges, were also practical and eager to learn skills they could see would benefit them. When she explained how mathematics could help them calculate ore yields or determine fair prices for goods, they paid attention. When she showed them how improved writing could help them communicate with distant family or conduct business, they practiced their letters with determination. The exception was Ronald Turner, who continued to disrupt lessons and challenge her authority at every opportunity. Emma recognized the behavior for what it was, a test of her resolve and competence. The other children were watching to see how she would handle their most difficult peer. The confrontation came on a Friday afternoon when Ronald made a particularly crude comment about the futility of book learning for people destined to spend their lives digging in the dirt. Emma felt the classroom go silent, all eyes focused on her response. "Mr. Turner," she said calmly, "please step outside with me." Ronald's eyes widened slightly, but he could not back down without losing face. He followed her onto the school's small porch, where Emma closed the door behind them. "You think I am wasting your time," she said without preamble. "Are not you?" Ronald's voice cracked slightly, betraying his youth despite his attempt at adult disdain. "That depends on what you want from your life," Emma replied. "If you are content to spend your days following orders from men who can read and write better than you can, then yes, I am wasting your time." Ronald flushed, and Emma saw she had struck close to home. "But if you want to be the man giving orders, if you want to own your own mind or run your own business, or simply ensure that no one can cheat you because you cannot read a contract, then perhaps your time here has value." She let that sink in before continuing. "I am not here to force education on anyone who does not want it, but I am here to offer it to those who do. The choice is yours, Mr. Turner." Ronald stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working as he struggled with conflicting impulses. Finally, he nodded once, sharply. "I will try," he said. "That is all anyone can ask." They returned to the classroom, and while Ronald's attitude did not transform overnight, his disruptions ceased, and he began participating in lessons with grudging interest. As autumn deepened into winter, Emma found herself settling into the rhythms of mountain life. The work was harder than anything she had known in Pennsylvania, but it was also more satisfying. She was making a real difference in these children's lives, giving them tools they would carry with them long after they left her classroom. The people of Cedar Falls gradually accepted her as well, no longer viewing her as a temporary outsider but as someone committed to their community. She was invited to social gatherings, asked to help with church events, and consulted on matters requiring her particular skills. Yet despite her growing contentment with her new life, Emma found herself thinking often of Michael Jones. True to his word, he appeared in town periodically for supplies, but their encounters were brief and formal. He would nod politely if they met on the street, perhaps exchange a few words about the weather or local news. But the easy intimacy of their journey to Cedar Falls seemed to have vanished. Emma told herself this was natural and appropriate. Michael had helped her reach safety and find employment. His obligation was fulfilled. She was a respectable schoolteacher now, with a reputation to maintain and responsibilities to her community. Whatever connection they had shared during those desperate days was best left in the past. But when she lay awake at night listening to the wind howl around the schoolhouse, she found herself remembering the warmth of his cabin, the steady competence with which he had managed every crisis, the quiet understanding in his eyes when she spoke of her losses and fears. Winter tightened its grip on the mountains with a ferocity that surprised even the longtime residents. Storm followed storm, each one seemingly more violent than the last. The school was forced to close for days at a time when the weather made travel impossible, and Emma worried about her students who lived in the more remote areas. It was during one of these fierce storms that she heard pounding on the schoolhouse door late one evening. Emma opened it to find Dorothy Campbell's father, his face grim with worry and exhaustion. "Mrs. Price," he said, snow swirling around him. "I need your help. Dorothy is missing." Emma's heart clenched with fear. Dorothy was one of her most responsible students, not given to foolish risks. She went to check on the sheep in the north pasture this morning before the storm hit. Should have been back hours ago. We have searched everywhere we can reach, but the snow is too deep and the wind too strong. Emma did not hesitate. "Let me get my coat." "Ma'am, you cannot come with us. This is dangerous work, and you are not equipped for mountain search and rescue." "Dorothy is my student," Emma said firmly. "I will not sit here warm and safe while she is lost in this storm." Before the man could argue further, another figure appeared out of the swirling snow. Michael Jones materialized on the porch like something conjured from Emma's worried thoughts, his face set in grim lines. "Heard about the girl," he said without preamble. "Came to help with the search." Emma felt a surge of relief so intense it nearly buckled her knees. If anyone could find Dorothy in this wilderness, it would be Michael. "Thank God," Dorothy's father said. "Michael, you know this country better than anyone. Where would a lost child seek shelter?" Michael was already studying the storm, gauging wind direction and intensity with the practiced eye of a man who had survived many such nights. "North pasture, you said?" She would try to get back to familiar ground, but the storm would have turned her around. Likely she is holed up somewhere between here and there, waiting for it to pass. "We have looked everywhere," the father protested. "Not everywhere," Michael said. "There are places only someone who knows the mountains would think to check." He turned to Emma, his expression serious. "I am going out there. You should stay here where it is safe." "No," Emma said. "I am coming with you, Emma." It was the first time he had used her given name since their journey to Cedar Falls, and the intimacy of it sent warmth through her despite the circumstances. "This is not safe. The storm could kill us both." "Then it will kill us both," Emma said. "But I will not abandon Dorothy." Michael studied her face in the lamplight, seeing the determination there, the steel that had been forged in the crucible of loss and hardship. "Stay close," he said. "Do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you. No questions, no hesitation." "I understand." They set out into the storm, Michael leading with the sure instincts of a man who could navigate by feel and intuition when visibility dropped to zero. Emma followed in his footsteps, trusting his judgment completely as they pushed through snow that sometimes reached her waist. The wind was a living thing, clawing at them with icy fingers, trying to separate them and lead them astray. Emma lost all sense of direction within minutes, but Michael pressed on with unwavering purpose, checking landmarks she could not see, reading signs in the landscape that were invisible to her untrained eyes. They searched for what felt like hours, checking every possible shelter, every depression or overhang where a frightened child might have taken refuge. Emma's feet grew numb despite her heavy boots, and her face stung from the driven snow, but she pushed on, driven by the image of Dorothy alone and terrified in this white hell. It was Michael who finally heard it, a sound so faint it was almost lost in the wind's howl. He held up a hand for silence, his head cocked as he listened intently. "There," he said, pointing toward a cluster of boulders barely visible through the snow. "Someone is crying." They fought their way through the drifts to the rocks, where they found a small cave formed by the tumbled stones. Inside, huddled in a space barely large enough for her small body, was Dorothy Campbell. She was conscious but hypothermic, her lips blue with cold, and her body shaking uncontrollably. "Dorothy," Emma called softly, crawling into the cramped space. "We are here. You are safe now." The girl's eyes focused on Emma's face with difficulty, recognition dawning slowly. "Mrs. Price? How did you find me?" "Mr. Jones knew where to look," Emma said, wrapping her own coat around Dorothy's shivering form. "Can you walk?" "I think so. My feet are very cold." Michael appeared at the cave entrance, his expression relieved but still grim. "We need to get her warm and get back to town quickly. This storm is getting worse." The journey back was a nightmare of struggling through deepening snow while supporting Dorothy's weakening steps. The girl was brave and tried not to complain, but Emma could feel her growing weaker as the cold sapped her remaining strength. Halfway back, Dorothy stumbled and could not get up again. Michael scooped her into his arms without hesitation, carrying her like a child as he continued to break trail through the storm. Emma stayed close behind, ready to help if he faltered, but Michael's strength seemed inexhaustible. They reached the schoolhouse as Dorothy's father and the other searchers were preparing to expand their efforts. The reunion was tearful and grateful, with Dorothy's parents thanking Michael and Emma repeatedly for their courage in venturing out into the deadly storm. As the family departed for their own home, promising to return in the morning to check on Dorothy's condition, Emma found herself alone with Michael in the schoolhouse. The contrast between the howling storm outside and the warm safety of the small building was almost overwhelming. "She will be all right," Michael said, reading the worry in Emma's expression. "Mountain children are tough. She will learn from this and be more careful in the future." Emma nodded, but she was thinking about more than Dorothy's physical recovery. Tonight had shown her something about herself, something about the person she was becoming in this harsh but honest land. "I was terrified out there," she admitted, "but I could not have stayed behind." "Fear is not the absence of courage," Michael said. "It is acting despite the fear." Emma looked at him. This man who had appeared in her life like an answer to prayers she had not known she was praying. "Why did you come tonight? How did you even know Dorothy was missing? Word travels fast in small communities." "And he paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "I could not bear the thought of you in danger." The admission hung between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Emma felt her heart begin to race, not from the exertion of their rescue mission, but from the possibilities suddenly opening before her. "Michael," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "The storm is passing," he said, though Emma could still hear the wind battering the walls. "I should go. Should you?" Emma stepped closer, close enough to see the conflict in his eyes. "Or do you want to go?" "What I want," Michael said carefully, "and what is wise are not always the same thing." "Perhaps wisdom is overrated," Emma said, surprising herself with her boldness. "Perhaps sometimes we should trust what we want." Michael looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he reached out and touched her face, his callous fingers gentle against her cold cheek. "Emma," he said, and her name on his lips was like a prayer. The kiss, when it came, was inevitable and perfect, the culmination of weeks of unspoken longing and carefully maintained distance. Emma melted into Michael's embrace, feeling truly safe for the first time since Thomas's death, not because she was protected, but because she was no longer alone. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, their faces flushed with more than cold. "I have been thinking about you," Michael admitted. "More than I should." "And you," Emma confessed. "I told myself it was gratitude, that what I felt was simply appreciation for your help. But it is more than that." "Much more," Michael agreed. They stood close together, the storm forgotten, the rest of the world reduced to the small circle of warmth and light that surrounded them. Emma felt as if she were standing at the edge of a precipice, about to leap into an unknown future that both terrified and exhilarated her. "What happens now?" she asked. Michael was quiet for a moment, his hands still framing her face. "Now we see if two people who have learned to survive alone can learn to live together. And if we cannot, then we will have tried," Michael said. "And trying is better than wondering." Emma smiled, feeling something that had been frozen inside her for months finally begin to thaw. "Yes," she said, "it is." Outside, the storm was indeed passing, the wind dying to a whisper and the snow falling more gently. But inside the schoolhouse, two people who had found each other in the wilderness were just beginning to discover what it might mean to build a life together. Emma Price had come west as a widow, broken by loss and abandoned by circumstances beyond her control. She had fallen to her knees in the snow, ready to surrender to despair and death. But Michael Jones had appeared like Providence itself, offering not just rescue but the possibility of renewal. The mountains had tested them both, stripping away everything non-essential until only truth remained. And the truth was that they had found in each other something worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect and nurture. As dawn broke over Cedar Falls, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold, Emma knew that her real journey was just beginning. The widow who had knelt in despair was gone, replaced by a woman who had discovered her own strength and found someone worthy of sharing it with. The mountain man had said, "Not today," when death came calling in the snow. Now, together they would say, "Not today," to loneliness, to despair, to all the forces that sought to break the human spirit. They would build something lasting in this harsh but honest land, something that could weather any storm. And in the schoolhouse where Emma taught mountain children to read and write and dream of better futures, love had taken root like a hardy mountain flower, beautiful and strong enough to bloom even in the hardest ground.